good evening to you. On behalf of the Calgary Climate Hub, I welcome you to A Climate of Change, our weekly live cast exploring with thought leaders from across Canada what this wildly unprecedented moment in history means for our province, this country, the economic system, and specifically the climate crisis. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, the Yaqsi Nakota Nations, the Métis Nations of Region 3, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. I'd also like to make a second land acknowledgement on behalf of another group of folks that have a stake in the land that we stand on today, and that is our children, our nieces and nephews and grandchildren, and all future generations. I urge you to keep them in mind during this time and as we face unprecedented change and start making decisions about what comes next. I want to quickly thank our sponsor, Skyfire Energy, who I'll talk about again a little later on in the show. For those of you watching tonight via Facebook Live, please feel free to post some of your questions for our guest, as well as for the folks participating in the Zoomcast. Please post your questions using the Q&A button that I believe is at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Tonight's guest is Professor and Author Mark Jaccard, whose latest book, The Citizen's Guide to Climate Success, tackles not only the myths our society uses to maintain a broken status quo, but also the myths that we climate activists engage in ourselves as we fight for the change the world needs. In my humble opinion, this book should be required reading for climate activists and organizations like the Calgary Climate Hub. Professor Jaccard has made the link free to read via PDF. So we'll post a link to that in the chat, but it's also a good one for your bookshelf. So we'll post the Amazon link, and maybe along the way, we'll see if we can find a local bookstore that you could order it from so we can help our local businesses. Mark Jaccard, welcome to the Climate of Change.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so I mean, to start with, I just want to ask a wide open question. What's your take on what you're seeing right now?
So, you know, what people ask me about, and of enormous concern to Albertans, is you've got this crazy low price of oil, and you know, the profitability of oil-related investments in Alberta don't look good at that kind of price. And I think the first thing I would say to them, so it's sort of a good news, bad news story. I mean, the good news is that this will not last and the price of oil will recover. The bad news, if you're an Albertan who wants your economy to still be oil-based for decades and decades to come, is that, well, we can think about climate and the efforts to stop the growing demand for oil worldwide. But B, even if we don't stop it, there are just alternative ways of making oil around the world, and with innovations have become much cheaper relative to the oil sands. And so even if we see a price recovery of oil, and I think we will, the oil sands could still be in trouble. So I guess there's my answer to my initial answer to your question, which is to say, right now, we've deliberately shut down our economies, and of course, if the demand for a product like oil falls, its price will plummet. And that's a big message in my book, by the way, which has got nothing to do with COVID-19, and I can talk about that later. But the price plummeted for short-term reasons. When we fire up the economy again, I do believe the price will recover, but it might not recover to those levels that would make you want to invest in expanding the oil sands, which was the mindset just a few years ago.
Yeah, the term that people are using is that we've hit peak demand, where, you know, for those of us who've been paying attention for some time, there's talk of peak oil, that at some point the oil becomes too expensive to extract. It's too hard to get a hold of. So the opposite is, we've watched the opposite happen. We've become acquainted with the term negative oil, and with everything that you're saying, and then, you know, you look back at everything that's hit Alberta oil from Alberta Oil and Gas over the, you know, prior to the coronavirus. then you have to, before we're able to talk about recovering, we have a global stockpile that's happening worldwide. And so do you have a sense of, how long, like when we talk about oil coming back to a certain price, when we tack that global stockpile onto the end of whatever happens due to the coronavirus crisis, how long are we looking at before we can count on this being something relatively stable, if ever again?
Right. I wouldn't worry too much about the stockpiles. I mean, those only, cover you for a few weeks or a month or whatever. But I'm glad that you raised the term peak demand, and I'm going to explain why in kind of a funny circuit way to promote my book. My book is about how what if I got a group of 20 of the world's leading experts on any given issue, how would they come out on that? And so what it does is it enables me to try to expose things that I've noticed all the time, because I'm spending a lot of time with the global experts. What are the things where wishful thinking biases have affected us? And so this one might surprise you, but even peak demand, the evidence doesn't show that. We're in a short run peak in demand because we shut down our economies. But there's been a wishful thinking among environmentalists that, isn't demand going to peak now? And that's not at all what's been happening over the last years. The demand growth in the developing world for oil has been phenomenal. And so I did a paper on like the future of the oil sands, which only published a year or so ago. And our numbers were like, the global demand is 95 million barrels a day. And then it was just like the reviewers of the paper were like, well, no, it's over 100 now. And there's looking at the International Energy Agency, it just keeps growing, gets up to 140 million barrels a day. If we're acting on climate the way we have been globally. So peak demand is not the thing that's happening. It should happen because we should be acting on climate, but we haven't been. So you could be, if you're an Albertan who is just like, I just want to make money from oil and I just don't want to worry about anything else, you might be able to say, at least there'll be a rising demand for oil. The problem is the supply of oil. There was already a whole bunch of really low cost suppliers out there. And we know that, right? The OPEC countries and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia might produce 10 to 12 million barrels a day. They could be producing 20 million barrels a day just as cheaply. And then along comes the Americans, going from like 2 or 3 million barrels a day finally up to 10, 12 million barrels a day at a price lower than the oil sands. So that's the funny thing. It hasn't been the success of climate policy globally, and therefore a global peak in the demand for oil, that spells trouble for the oil sands in the long run. So far, what it's been is alternative supply to the oil sands that's cheaper, and that's there, and it's a big challenge, and it has been. But so that's sort of what's going on. So when I answer questions, I'm always going to be saying, what's the long run trend? What's the long run trend if we do something about climate? And then what's the short run COVID thing? And how do we separate those, I guess?
Right. Yeah, okay. So one of the questions we're trying to ask all of our guests is about teachable moments. Now, when I quite like that Orwell quote of yours about the realities crushing some of the things the myths that the hard reality that crushes those things. What's your favorite teachable moment from this time? For myself, it was just that as a climate advocate, I've always been told, we could never afford that. And now I'm looking around and it's like, well, it turns out when you get hit with a pandemic, for example, or if you take a crisis very seriously, it turns out all sorts of things can be afforded. What's your favorite teachable moment that you're seeing right now?
Right. So that's really interesting, and I think what you're saying is really, really important, because it's trying to say, wait a minute, what are the things that we said we couldn't do, and then suddenly we actually could do them quite quickly. And that's happened to me throughout my career. I remember people saying to me, you could never shut down coal plants. How could we ever have an electricity system without coal plants? And then along comes a government in Alberta that says we're going to shut all the coal plants by 2030. And now the federal government says that. So those are great moments if you've been in the field a long time like I've been, because people said you couldn't do that, and then boom, you did it. It was George Bush in Texas as the governor who put in a renewable requirement for wind. And it's the wind that eventually helped wipe out the coal plants in Texas as they're going down as well. But
Yeah.
I'm going to flip your question and say, what are the things we might mislearn from this? So things that we thought we learned and actually weren't.
Mm-hmm.
And the example I'm going to use is that greenhouse gas emissions have gone way down. So people might say, oh, this is great. So when we come out of this, we'll just keep doing the same things that made those greenhouse gas emissions go down. And I'm going to say that's a mislearned thing. I've been hearing that a fair bit. I've even been hearing people say, as we rebuild the economy, we'll make it a greener economy. It'll be a decarbonized economy. And what I need to point out to people is that actually, we didn't do anything about what we economists call the capital stock. That's the physical things that burn oil products or burn coal or natural gas that cause greenhouse gases and climate change. We didn't do anything. The cars are still sitting there. We didn't crush them. The planes are still there. We didn't crush them. The coal plants are still there. The factories are still there. The schools, the universities, the restaurants. And they're all still running on fossil fuels when we crank them up again. So there's a tendency to look at what's happened and say, oh, we've learned a lot here. Look at what we can do. And my sort of warning to people is, no, we've seen this in the past. We had a big recession in 2008. We had unless you put in climate policies that either make fossil fuels more expensive, because they're wonderful, or regulate them. And if we allow the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers to convince governments to roll back climate policies, that will be the bad outcome that comes out of this.
Yeah, the term that I took a number of terms out of your book that are now part of what I roll around with, and so I'll tell you that I got a lot out of your book, and I recommend it to everybody who's watching. I feel like it made me smarter. Period. End of sentence. And that, to me, that's the value. That's all I could ask for from a book. So one of the terms that you mention, you talk about a lot, is about policy windows. And in fact, it's valuable for climate. This is another reason why climate advocates should be reading your book. And it is, I'll say it again, it's free. You can get it for free from PDF, but it also looks good on the bookshelf. So go and buy one.
Yeah, don't say it's free too often.
That's right. Fair enough. We're trying to make it work here. Is an unprecedented policy window opening up for us? I mean, I understand what you're saying about not having walking around with the certainty that we're all just going to emerge from this and say, no, we want the birds singing in the trees and all of these things. It's something we'll have to work for. But do you feel like let's say the Overton window for what might be acceptable policy to try to shoot for climate advocates has changed due to this?
Right. No.
Damn.
And I will explain. In the book, I talked about a policy window as this period during which a strange configuration of events has made it that politicians, even if they're somewhat insincere about climate, feel compelled to act. And we have had historical periods when that happened. And we were just in a recent one, which is the sort of the Paris in 2015 and the few years just after that. And COVID closed that policy window. And in fact, in the book, I write about that. I say, oh my goodness, we've got a series of politicians of situations where public awareness, they put climate at the top of the poll, and so politicians of different stripes feel compelled to do this. Now be careful, because some of them will give lip service, they're insincere. You'll know if they're sincere if they're either putting a price on carbon, so that's like the carbon tax Alberta had for a while and BC has, and now we have federally, so Alberta has it again, or regulations like phasing out coal plants, methane regulations, vehicle regulations, and so on. And in the book I say, so you have these tiny windows to get those policies in, and then something will come along and take and close the policy window. And I say it'll be an economic recession, it will be a war, a terrorist attack, an enormous political scandal, or a pandemic. I say that.
Yeah.
And I didn't know the pandemic was coming, but I mean, I was thinking SARS, because I remember people, lost focus. So it's not a bad thing that happens. It would be a bad thing if we've actually had some good policies coming into place. The policy in Alberta that affects large industrial emitters is actually quite a good policy. And the federal policy is modeled on that. And now finally, we have a federal government that's saying, I guess I can't leave it up to all the provinces because it'll be a mishmash. And so we've got a federal government that has put in a carbon price that's rising over time, putting in stronger regulations and developing really good regulations that I've been working on. And we need to keep that moving. And really, that's the only way that equipment I told you about, airplanes, cars, buildings, factories, electricity plants, it's only with those policies that we move away from burning coal, oil, and gas to using renewables, possibly some fossil fuels. I still think there's great hope for Alberta with using fossil fuels, capturing the carbon and burying it and making hydrogen or electricity. And I wrote about that 15 years ago with a book called Sustainable Fossil Fuels. And so, but we need those policies to stay in place. So I actually see the current juncture or period in history as, I'll call it a rear guard action, like that we're like, don't lose out, don't let, because I can tell you, I do advice at federal, provincial levels, and the fossil fuel industry is saying to governments, it's too hard on people right now. Let's unravel those good policies you had, because COVID means that has to happen. So I'm trying to alert environmentalists, others, academics, media, to stick with those policies. And that the book is about that, right? I mean, the book doesn't say we're going to have a pandemic, but the book says, keep your eye on the ball. Like, don't give up on that.
Yeah, well, so reading the book, it's very prescient, because what you were predicting oil and gas champions would do, we're watching them do, where they're saying, no, we can't afford to do the carbon tax right now. We've got to, so it was, you called that perfectly, I guess, and a number of things perfectly. But I guess the question that I would have is, during this time, we have a federal government, that's looking at how to bail out certain areas. Do you take it as a good sign that what they're doing for oil and gas in Alberta is they're taking care of those orphaned oil wells and other things, instead of just throwing buckets of cash at corporate oil and gas?
Absolutely. And I commend the federal government for this. And I think the whole government, I do give a lot of credit to the Minister of Environment, Jonathan Wilkinson. I think he's had a fairly strong role on this. I mean, I don't see the inner workings, but from what I hear, and even just, what I've heard about him, because, much of my family comes from Alberta. I've always been very connected to Alberta. So I think people will tell you that even if I get angry at the fossil fuel industry sometimes, no one would ever accuse me of being an Alberta basher. Like, I'm always defending Alberta. I mean, when people were attacking Alberta because it had emissions, and I was saying, but that's for the cars you're driving in Ontario, and you're making gasoline cars. Like, how can you be throwing stones at Alberta? Move to electric cars. Or biofuel or whatever. So, I mean, I do think that the federal government right now needs to hang on to those, policies, the regulations and pricing, and then it does need to help Alberta. It needs to help Alberta with transition. So let's do even more, like on the electricity side. Let's do more on electric vehicle side. And yes, if we're going to put money into helping Albertans, well, I mean, they're already going to help by building a pipeline. But aside from that, let's do it the way you said, where you're not actually helping to cause directly a new investment that expands the oil sands, but you are saying we got to help the people who are in that sector and have lost their jobs. And so let's put them to something that creates value to Canada in the long run. It's sad that it's to clean up wells. The oil industry should have been cleaning up, but that's better than nothing. And so, yes, I agree with the premise of your question. Absolutely.
Do you think, for me as a climate advocate here in Alberta, obviously it's a complicated place to be doing this, but I wouldn't want to be doing it anywhere else. We have the leadership that we have at the provincial level, and that's an ideological opposition. I do feel like there's a climate partner in the federal government right now with the Trudeau government. And in your book, you talk about voluntary international agreements and new climate clubs that go on between countries that are a part of the low carbon transition or the for that sort of thing. So do you feel like maybe we could see Canada showing some leadership in that capacity?
I'm really glad you've asked this question. I think it's an excellent question. And
I ask
it allows
excellent
me also,
questions, man, I'll tell you.
well, every one of them has been, so you get my kudo. But, so as you're getting a sense and through the book that, I mean, my goal is to be evidence-based and let the chips fall where they may. And so, I mean, an argument that an Albertan might make, it doesn't have to be, it could be British Columbian and also an oil industry, but it could be someone else. And they'll say, why are you trying to make us reduce our emissions in the production of oil when the people around the world are just going to get oil from somewhere else? Like you're not solving this global problem. And as an economist, I have to say that that's true. Like that it's a global oil market. There's huge potential to make oil elsewhere. And so, but then let's think strategically now. If we actually care about trying to cause greenhouse gas reductions, and we know it's a global problem, and we don't have a global government, and we don't have a binding global agreement, then what do we do? Now, the cop-out is the person that the character I just gave is somebody who is using that, who says, oh, well, someone else will produce the oil. And so then they're like, so let's just keep doing what we're doing and we'll all go to hell together. That's the final part of what they're saying. And so the better response to that is to say, you're right, it is a global problem. So we should be leaders, reducing our emissions, and then we should be part of creating the global effort that's needed. And so I think that's a good argument. If I were the government today, I would be saying, hey, you're right, it is a global problem. So we reduce our own emissions and we go global. So the Canadian government, and I was so happy to see this, it really, that kind of thing is a rush for me. In 2015, they're in Paris, and every country kind of agreed to its own targets. And to be honest with you, I felt all that was kind of window dressing. Then the federal government, though, said, we're going to team up with the United Kingdom, and we're going to create this thing called Powering Past Coal. And what it is we're going to start building a larger and larger group of countries that commit to phasing out coal plants. And then what we want is, I mean, and they're talking about this, is to eventually get to the tariffs and, charges on those countries that are not part of the club. And that's the only way, in my view, that we're likely to get global action. So I was very excited about that. And I've been arguing the next step, and the Norwegians are kind of leading on this. The Norwegians are an oil exporter. So think of them as being like Alberta. And they're going out and saying, we're going to stop using oil in our own economy. And they're moving fast to electric vehicles, like ridiculously fast. They're still exporting oil. And they're saying, we'll export oil, but we know it's going to die out. And we want to be part of a global movement to get past oil in transportation. And we'll team up with the Chinese who are moving to electric vehicles and with the Californians. And I want Canada to be part of that. And I think the federal government is starting to think that way. So my long-winded answer to your question is that was really important to me, that the federal government be saying, how do I trigger global action and to act on that? And it's really sad, as you say, kind of ideological, that I don't see more conservative politicians doing that. That why can't they say, oh yeah, you're right, it's a global problem. Therefore, we better figure out how to make global action happen. Let's be serious about this, instead of just using it as an excuse to stay on a horrendous path.
Yeah, I keep waiting to hear the conservative case for climate action. I could certainly make it. There's a brand new industry there. These guys are supposed to be really good at this. Why don't we do that? Yeah. Can't we do that?
Yeah. I mean, I don't get it. I mean, I get it, but I don't get it. So maybe we're in the same boat that way.
Right. So, we talked about the peril of assuming that this is going to change everything, from a climate perspective. I guess the question would be, can this be the thing though? Like, without assuming that we're going to get it, can this happen? And can, what can a climate activist like myself do, or a climate organization like the Calgary Climate Hub do, to try to force that policy window, or to hold that sucker open, or,
Well, I think, so for me, in the book, I describe that it's really domestically where you have more leeway to do something. So, personally, I don't think you're going to get the emissions down from fossil fuel, from oil production in Alberta. And let them try. So we have this good policy we have, but I don't see that. Like, I see more that there'll be oil sands in the longer term, if we have any global success in moving away from oil for transportation, then they are the high cost producer. And so you don't really need to worry about their emissions. They'll slowly, they just won't be growing anymore. And hopefully they last for a long time to help workers make a transition, but they won't be growing, which is the bad scenario. So then what am I talking about? I'm saying the same thing actually for the steel industry, the chemical industry, the aluminum industry, the cement industry, the pulp and paper industry. So all of these big emission intensive industries, and they're half of our emissions. So we can say, oh, we're all going to behave differently, but our emissions are from these industries that it's hard to act significantly with them because it's part of global trade. You'll just lose the industry elsewhere. So where do you reduce emissions? It's in electricity sector, it's transportation, and it's in our buildings.
Yeah. So,
and then the question is, are people in a position right now to invest significantly in converting their natural gas or oil furnace to an electric heat pump? Are they in a position to get an electric vehicle or what are we doing to help make all that happen? So we need to keep moving in the electricity sector and phase out those coal plants. Don't replace them just with natural gas plants. And then we need to, so yes, when it comes to things the federal government or any government could do right now, I've been arguing really help people in switching away from gasoline pickup trucks, diesel pickup trucks, and so on. And also in fuel switching in their home. So you insulate a home and make it electric with an electric heat pump. So that's be the kind of programs that we're trying to get jobs out there. Installing electric rechargers or making them be installed in every apartment or townhouse complex, and that's jobs and that's part of a recovery. And so I have been involved. I'm on the federal Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, and in BC I'm on the advisory group. And those are some of the things that we've said to the government to focus on here. But you'll see that they're not profound. And the reason is because it's really the regulatory and pricing policies, and you see this anywhere in the world, whether it's California or Scandinavia, that cause that flipping of the economy away from burning coal, oil, and natural gas.
Right. Okay, switching. Well, actually, no. I do want to ask if we were going to push through an Alberta New Deal. that we were, that was going to create prosperity and reduce climate and all of these things. Is there like, one or two really low hanging fruit that you would say, this is what you switch to, guys? There's money there and it works for climate. And what would you suggest for that?
Right. So that's a good point. And I might call it the just transition or something. But actually, it is an Alberta New Deal. Like I don't like the word New Deal used in the United States because they had a full employment economy, and then they were like, and so I just thought it was a misnomer. But actually, New Deal works in Alberta because you had whether it was jobs in the oil sands, but also all of the industries that involved in expanding oil sands. So all the new construction and so on, and those people have all lost their jobs. Well, let's take electricity. In the electricity sector, I mean, I was actually just been researching in the last few days, a group in Saskatchewan who are saying, oh my goodness, we have a lot of potential to take old coal plants, and Saskatchewan has a bunch of them that are down along the border with the US. Alberta's coal plants are further north, not that far from forest land areas, but also with access to agricultural land. And you see this in, we've seen it in Ontario where they started to put biomass into a coal plant, but you've also seen it in Denmark, even agricultural residues into the coal. They're switching their coal plants over. And Alberta has an enormous, so instead of just building a bunch of natural gas plants, and I understand building some of them, but you could be building converting the coal plants to biomass, whether it's crop residues, willow plantations, or sawmill residue, and you get quite a bit of that, making electricity, and then capturing the CO2 that would come out of the smokestack and burying it, because you have the best place in the world to bury CO2. There is jobs in agriculture from that. There's jobs in forestry. There's all of the skills, the same skill sets that you have in the oil industry and in the electricity industry. There's one example. At the same time, you would do a lot of wind power in Alberta, and I know that's happening. And you combine those kind of things, you can get the Alberta electricity system quite rapidly as part of a just transition or New Deal, get its emissions to fall the way they did in Ontario when they closed all those coal plants. And other jurisdictions have done that as well. And then that electricity, that's where you have a program for converting houses from natural gas to electric heat pumps. And again, that's a job-intensive, labor-intensive kind of program that would be a fantastic way to go. Now, I know it's difficult when natural gas is so cheap, but that's where we need regulations or pricing to make sure we overcome that.
Right. So last question for me, and then we have a few panelists. But, speaking of false beliefs meeting the crushing realities, humans allowed, in my opinion, humans allowed economic considerations to supersede scientific ones, and they caused a climate crisis. Now, I feel like this same dynamic pushes many jurisdictions to open for business before they've flattened the curve. To me, hard realities seem imminent and will be arriving quickly. Do you agree with that? And will we learn from this?
Right. So I actually don't have an opinion.
Okay.
I am someone, of course I can have opinions. I'm always someone who really follows science, just as you were saying. And I just end up defending the scientists. So for example, in British Columbia, we have Bonnie Henry. She's our chief public health officer. And it's funny, even through Twitter or email, my relations or family, I have a lot of family in British Columbia. And you'll hear different people will say, oh, we shouldn't listen to her. And it's that same old, it can be an anti-scientist bias, right? And I'll sort of say, wait a minute, that's not just her. she's the spokesperson for a whole bunch of scientists getting together and trying to figure out the best thing to do. And there's no right answer, but they're doing the best they can. And that's what climate science is all about. And so I'm much more kind of like, I'm listening to her now, and it doesn't mean I follow her blindly, but I listen to her. And then when she says, we've got new information now, and actually you can get together with people, but you've got to have masks on or whatever, then I will probably be willing to go along with that. I do know there are jurisdictions in the United States that just don't seem to be paying attention at all to scientists. And they're like, it's just so political. And I mean, that's the big challenge in the US. And I think you would agree with me that Canada's been a lot better. But I do understand your concern, which is there are people who just say, oh, you know, I need to get my store open, and so I'm going to ignore risk on the health side. And yeah, I have concerns about that too.
I personally would like to see Calgary's numbers come down a lot more. Alberta seems to be flattening the curve, but I'm not sure about Calgary. And I'll tell you right now, I'm worried about it. I'm scared about that.
An Albertan friend just sent me stuff like 2 days ago comparing Edmonton and Calgary, or that was the first I had heard about that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we shall see. Before we go to our panelists, I'll just do a shout out for our sponsor. Skyfire Energy has been designing and installing solar PV systems for homeowners, business owners, utilities, municipalities, and First Nations since 2001. They're an employee-owned, certified B Corporation with offices in Calgary, Edmonton, Penticton, and Regina. Their staff is one of the most experienced and qualified teams in the industry, having completed many of the largest and most complex solar projects in Western Canada. Their vision is to bring the magic of solar power to the world for a stronger, healthier, and more sustainable global community. Okay, we're going to go to our panelists. I think while we're waiting for our first one to come up, we do have a number of questions on Facebook Live. So I might hit one of those up while we're waiting for our first panelist to come on board. So we have a Patrick, who I think is from Tokyo, if I remember correctly. But he says, with the 2018 GHG inventory for Canada just released, how has policy change been reflected in the increase of CO2 over the 2017 inventory?
Oh, okay. So Patrick, I get asked questions like that a fair bit. And what I'm getting at is there are questions in which people say, you know, you guys put in a new policy in 2015. So in the period 2017 to 2018, what was the effect of that policy? And so Zhou Enlai was Mao Zedong's second-hand man in the Chinese Communist Party. And one time, some American president or Henry Kissinger, someone asked him, what do you think about the French Revolution in 1789? And his answer was, it's too early to tell. And I've always enjoyed that answer. It's like, here's what you need to do to change the capital stock. That is the cars, the trucks, the factories, the electricity plants in your economy over the next 3 decades. And you will start to detect this, I would hope, in a decade or a decade and a half. You know, so Sweden put in a carbon tax in 1991. And we started to, and we economists could say, oh, you're changing the price of energy. We know emissions will go down. And then, you know, you can start to sort of see it over 3, 5, 8 years. And certainly 15 years down the road, to say, here was the impact of the Swede. So I don't mean to be flippant about this, Patrick, but I personally would argue that you shouldn't look for effects of policies in a real short time frame. There are so many other up and down factors that affect policies. And we've even got an extreme one right now, which of course is the COVID shutdown of the economy. So how am I going to detect what the effect of a policy was? It was a policy that was supposed to get people to buy more electric cars. They aren't even buying more cars. They're not even driving the ones they've got right now. So that's why it's a bit dangerous, in my view, to focus on looking for short-term effects of a policy that just was put in 2 or 3 years ago.
Perfect. Okay, we have Romy on deck.
Hi there, how's it going? So I actually suspect you may answer my question quite similarly to the question that you just answered now. Sorry, can you hear me at this point? Perfect. So I'm curious about how, the argument goes that carbon pricing is meant to disincentivize people from using lots of fossil fuels. Is it safe to assume that the effectiveness of that is severely reduced, given our current context? Gasoline and natural gas prices are trending down the way they have over the past decade. And so, as a layperson, what is the solution? Is it much higher carbon taxes or a bigger focus on regulation?
No, I think your question is a good one, because the reason that economists, and I'm an economist, the reason we like carbon pricing, and it could be a carbon tax or cap and trade system like Quebec and California have, which ends up the same. It puts the same kind of carbon price. Price of gasoline goes up by the same amount. So it's a form of carbon pricing. And we like carbon pricing because it gives a signal throughout the economy, and then everyone makes their own choices. I'm going to get an electric car. Someone else says, no, I'm just going to stop driving, or I'm going to take transit from now on. Each person makes the optimal choice for them, which is why carbon pricing is preferred. But it's really easy to lie about carbon pricing. It's easy for an insincere politician, and I describe this in the book, to be able to say, oh, that destroys the economy. There's more efficient ways to do this. I'll do it more efficient ways. Elect me, I'll get rid of the carbon price, and I'll do it a different way. And a more efficient way that saves your economy. And the other way to do it is, the only other way to do it is with regulations, as you just said at the end of your question. Now, there's a couple of things there. One, I do a lot of work in this area, and you can actually design regulations so that they're not that bad compared to carbon pricing. Like, they're a little less efficient, but they're not so bad. And a lot of leading jurisdictions are doing that, whether it's Sweden or California, a lot of them, and British Columbia, and now our federal government. And so you can use regulations. And another challenge, and so I don't advocate carbon, like I try to give the right all the full information to the policy maker and make them, you don't need to argue for carbon pricing or argue for regulations. You have to argue for one of them though. And the challenge that you got at with carbon pricing is that you're kind of chasing your tail. Like, even if it wasn't this short-term thing of COVID and we shut down and then the oil price collapsed, in my book I explain, even this was a nice gradual longer-term thing where we were phasing out oil with a carbon price. The price of oil, that there'd be the same number of people trying to sell oil, and their market is declining. They would start playing cutthroat with each other in competition, and that would drive the price of oil down. And I even published a paper on this in the journal Climatic Change or Climatic Policy a couple of years ago, showing that if humanity got on the right trajectory to stay within 2 degrees Celsius temperature increase, then the price of oil would start to get really low in about 10, 15, 20, 25 years. And so with a carbon price, just as you said, here you are raising the carbon price, but the price of oil is falling. So the gasoline price at the pump is maybe staying the same, or, so you have to keep raising that oil price, but that's difficult because it's politically difficult. Every time you try to jump up the oil price, the insincere politician says, oh, you're horrible, everybody vote for me, and I'll lower the price of oil and I'll lower the price of beer, or whatever their campaign slogan is. And so I think what you said is very wise, and therefore there may be times when you end up saying, I think I'll go with regulation. And so while even looking at the federal government, and we talk about, oh, they've done a carbon price, their coal plant phase out, well, let's just go with Alberta. Rachel Notley put in a carbon price our analysis showed that it would only do a tiny percentage of the emission reductions compared to her regulation to phase out coal plants, her regulation proposed for methane regs, and her tightening of the regulation on industry, the emissions intensive industries, those things. And yet she paid a very big political price for just this tiny increase in a carbon price that would have had almost no effect on the price of gasoline. So these are the kind of political trade-offs. I think your question's really dead on that sense.
Great, thank you.
So next up, we have Calgary emergency physician, Dr. Joe Vipond, and I should also mention he's a co-chair of the Climate Hub and a good friend. Go for it, Joe.
I'm muting myself. Hey, Mark. Thanks for joining us. I hope you found this fun. From a Calgary perspective, it's really great to have somebody who has such a good climate brain on their shoulders speak to us. So I guess going back to the carbon pricing, because I know you've been a carbon pricing pessimist for many years, and I think you've just mentioned that it hasn't worked politically for Alberta. But it seems to be working politically for federally. I know we're always just one election away from losing it if the Conservatives get into power. But yet the last election climate seemed to be very high up on the agenda, and with over 60% of Canadians supporting a party that supports carbon pricing, it almost feels like federally that battle is won. Do you have any changes in your opinion on carbon pricing in view of that, the politics of today, or are you still concerned that it's a politically inefficient way of getting things done?
Yeah, so I'm not convinced either way. I actually push back when my economist colleagues tell politicians that carbon pricing is essential. And it's not. So I think it's important to be honest about that. And I know you're not saying that, but I've run into that. We had this thing called the Ecofiscal Commission in Canada for 5 years, and they were singular policy. And I was trying to say, that's not even what's the driving policy in Scandinavia. Are you hearing me all right?
Mm-hmm.
Joe?
Yeah.
Oh, you're hearing me all right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Sorry, you just had a look on your face that made me nervous.
I was just going to ask a follow-up, so I was typing a little note saying I was going to ask a follow-up, but I'll wait for you to finish.
Okay, and then yes, cut back in. And so what the point I'm getting is, what is your driving policy? So when you say to me, it looks like carbon pricing has succeeded now federally, and I would argue carbon pricing has survived federally as a marginal policy. So when I and my modelers model the federal policies and take out the carbon pricing, it's not, the emission reductions that are driven by federal policies happen anyway, or almost all of them happen. And they happen for the reasons I was saying. It's because of these regulations. I mean, the big one is to phase out the coal plants. Oh my goodness. And then the second thing is, and this has been an issue for a while. So even when Stéphane Dion lost the federal election on carbon pricing, so 2008, I think it was, so 12 years ago, so I've advised governments for a long time. I cross paths a fair bit with people who do surveys for political purposes. And what they're not interested in whether 60% of Canadians or 50% of Canadians support carbon pricing. They're interested in 2 to 3% of Canadians in the key swing ridings who might be willing to vote single issue. So a lot of people do vote single issue. Like they'll say, I don't like car insurance, I'm going to vote against this government. Or I don't like the carbon tax, it's punitive of me. I live in the 905, the suburban area of Toronto. I've got to drive the kids to soccer and so on. The Conservatives have promised me if they win this election, they'll get rid of that carbon tax and they'll still achieve the climate objectives. And so all I'm saying is, I would not come to the conclusion that you tentatively seem to present, which is that the battle's won federally. And I think you would know if it was one federally, if the federal government came out today and said, oh, by the way, we know the carbon tax has to get to $200. We're committed to achieving the Paris target. So we know it has to get to over $200 per ton of CO2. That's a big increase in the price of gasoline from where it would have been over the next 8 or 9 years. And we're committed to doing that to achieve our Paris target. They're not doing that. What they're saying is we're going to revise the clean fuel standard. We're going to revise a policy so that I'm hearing that when the coal plants are phased out, it isn't just going to be natural gas plants in those jurisdictions like Alberta and Saskatchewan. They're looking at possibly a vehicle emission standard like we have in British Columbia and Quebec. So what we're seeing is what we've seen in California. California has a cap and trade system and some pricing, and it's all regulations almost entirely that are driving reductions in California. And my question to you is, what do you and I care? Why do you care if it's carbon price or a regulation?
Fair enough. I guess I just wonder about the moral problem of having this externality not priced. Like, it just seems, we know there's an externality there. We know it should be factored into accounting somewhere in the system, and yet we're not doing that. And would you just say that we do that just via regulations then?
Yeah, and the regulation is an implicit pricing of an externality. So when we got rid of ozone depleting substances, we didn't have a big fight about what price to set at them. We said, we got to phase this stuff out. Let's do it. When we did that with lead in gasoline, when we did it with sulfur in gasoline, there were a few sulfur pricing programs. Even the big one in the United States only did about 25% of the heavy lifting. It was done by regulation. In Ontario, we had a little bit of one. So we got rid of acid rain. We dealt with urban air pollution. We've dealt with ozone depleting substances, lead, the 12 toxins. All of these things we've done with regulation. I'm not promoting regulation. I'm just giving you the evidence. We didn't say, oh, for moral reasons, let's not do this until we've put a price on it. We've said we have to stop doing this. And the price will be the fine that you pay as a refiner if you're still putting lead in gasoline, or you're still producing a gasoline that causes a lot of NOx or has sulfur in it. Here, you're going to jail, and that's the price. And so that's society's an environment. That's kind of 90% of what we've done since 1970.
Okay, our next panelist is Mackenzie, and Mackenzie is one of the Fridays for Future youth climate movement folks, and so we're very happy to have her here to ask questions. We'd like to provide a platform for our especially Calgary's climate youth. If it's tough to be a grown man fighting climate in this city, just imagine what it's like to be a youth member. So we're happy to have her here. Take it away, Mackenzie.
I'd like to thank you for your really balanced, thoughts on this whole climate transition and everything. And my question was, what do you think the timeline is for setting the regulations and policies and subsidizing what needs to happen in order to lower Canada and Alberta's greenhouse gas emissions? Do you think what point is too early or too late to implement these regulations?
Right. So, Mackenzie, probably shouldn't say this to you. I say this to older people. I mean, we are already too late in the sense that we should have acted a long time ago. And
yes.
And we did act a long time ago, but it was in baby steps. And there are cases where Alberta, in some sense, led the world. Like Alberta brought in the very thing you have on industry right now. It's an innovative policy, but you have to turn the stringency up. They brought in a policy on emission-intensive industry, and as a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, I'm on the chapter that does policy. I still point out the Alberta policy of 2005. Alberta were leaders in this. And so what's happening is, in different places around the world, we are putting in the right policies. Then some jurisdictions are moving faster than others. And in fact, among industrialized countries now, The latest I saw, it was 18 or 20 countries, now some are quite small and so on, whose emissions had stopped growing and were going down. And now Canada's are kind of sort of going down, because Alberta was going up and Ontario and Quebec were going down and British Columbia was about in the middle. But we actually needed them to be going down much faster. And I know you're aware of that. And so that's really the failing, is that we're not moving fast enough. The other thing is, the reason we in the industrialized world need to move fast is because then, and soon, we need to put pressure on the rest of the world, the developing world. We need to be saying to them, look, we know we're kind of too selfish as voters, and we won't re-elect a government if it transfers a bunch of money to build wind turbines in Vietnam. But in Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, Pakistan, India, you can't build any more coal plants, or we're going to put tariffs on you. And while you might say that's punitive, it's still a better thing, because you're the ones who will really be negatively affected, like by climate change. I mean, and that's the same thing with a pandemic. They don't have the sort of the sophisticated systems that we have of healthcare and government organization and technology and just organization in society, that they're going to feel the worst of climate change. So my answer is, there's lots of good things going on there. And the way we accelerated, in my view, and that's kind of the discussion I was just having, I guess, with Joe Vipond, was he and I were talking about carbon pricing as a policy. And I just said, it looks like from the evidence that it's one that's going to be hard to turn up fast. And the kind of things and I mean, you saw that with Rachel Notley. She came into power and said, we're going to phase out the coal plants in 15 years. She said that in 2015. And that might seem like it's way off, but imagine if you could get all the industrialized countries to phase out all their coal plants in 15 years and then prevent the building of coal plants in the developing world. And in my book, I show that electricity generation around the world and the transportation systems around the world, those two sectors, which you could do domestically and then push globally, account for more than 50% of those emissions into the year 2050. So apologize, but my long-winded answer to your excellent question is, we need to intensify the regulations and pricing in rich countries like ours. But we need to be doing that simultaneously with a real effort to make it happen in the developing world. And some of that will require us to put away sort of our idealism. And so I'm saying this, you're a young person. I'm not saying you're guilty of this, but I talk to a lot of young people, and they'll say, well, and also we got to help the developing world. And I'll say to them, we're not going to help them that much. We're not like that. That's not how somebody gets reelected in our country. Let's be realistic about that. We still want to save people in the developing world from the most horrendous effects of climate change. And that's probably going to involve global tariffs, which will be seen as punitive, but they're not.
Yeah, that answered it very well. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent question.
Thanks, Mackenzie. So I have, I'm going to go to one more question in the Q&A, and then what I hope is that we can reach out to you via Twitter for the questions that we didn't get answered, and maybe you don't mind responding to those down the road.
Sure.
Great.
Well, or I'll arrange with you maybe to even send a batch email to me. Sure. I'm on Twitter, but I'm not as reliable as you might hope. So yeah, sometimes my grad students help me on Twitter.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, no, we'll put something together and send that off to you, and then we'll shoot that out to everybody. Question I have is from Roger Gagne. He's a long-term Climate Hub partner of ours. And a great guy. So what he's asking, Dr. Jaccard, your home province of BC is doing an impressive job supporting and facilitating dramatically higher energy efficiency standards like net zero buildings. Will the power of their example inspire other provinces, or are some policy tools needed?
I lost the last 10 seconds of what you said. You're good now.
Yeah, okay. Oh, so I'll just go right through it again. Your BC is doing an impressive job supporting and facilitating dramatically higher energy efficiency standards like net zero buildings. do you think that will end up inspiring other provinces?
Oh, very interesting. So a fun part of I'll make a personal side to this. A fun part of my life is that I've trained energy economics, energy modelers, energy policy analysts for 30 years now. And I've graduated close to 100 master's, PhD students, no, it's over 100. And then you see them in these different positions. And just give a shout out to Matt Horn, who was my former student, but now sort of head of a sustainability group at the City of Vancouver. And then, I mean, he's done great work technically, but the kudos go to the politicians. We had a government run for 10 years by Gregor Robertson, and Andrea Reimer, and a lot of really good people that took political risks. So if you're going to be climate sincere, I'm not saying you should go out and just get yourself unelected. And that's why my discussion with Joe Vipond about don't do carbon pricing if it's just going to get you unelected and you could have done something else, then you're not helping anyone. So these were astute politicians at the municipal level. It's also easier because Vancouver itself is, very progressive and didn't have all the suburbs, which can be progressive, but can also not be. So Vancouver was able to really play a leadership role. And more recently, and so they were already doing that. And now they've really started to do it on buildings. So they've really committed to this idea of a climate emergency, and that so we therefore shouldn't be burning natural gas in buildings. And that's a hard sell because natural gas is cheap, and people like me said 15 years ago, it'll just keep getting cheaper. So you're going to have to be ready for that with your policies. And that's why the policies are regulatory mostly. And in fairness to the City of Vancouver staff and their politicians, they've done a really good job of working with the different interest groups as well. So the question was, do I think it can be a model for other places? I think absolutely, and I think it will be. Like, I think it's so much easier to argue something if you're an advocate in Fredericton, and there's already, and your politicians say, oh, I don't think you can do that. And you say, no. A Canadian city's already done it. Or Calgary or Edmonton or Lethbridge. And so that is really important. And I was very excited to see those things happen.
Okay, well, we're going to close out here, but I guess before I do, I just want to ask, is there anything that you want to communicate to our audience that you haven't had a chance to yet?
Well, thank you for that. And so first of all, I've really enjoyed this, and I thought every question was excellent. So I
ask excellent questions, man.
If I look animated and excited, I'm animated and excited. They're great questions. Well, the other thing is, I'm really sad right now because, Joe Vipond and others were organizing for me to come and speak in Alberta. And I love this opportunity, and I'd be happy to do this again. And I'm not someone who says you have to travel all the time, but I would have liked to have come as well because I used to come to Alberta a lot, and I just hate it when we caricature Albertans as this. And that happens a fair bit in British Columbia, where I am and where I'm hanging out with environmentalists. And I love the opportunity to get in and see Alberta with all its richness and diversity. And even the people I interact with who are in the fossil fuel industry there's so many caring people. It's always difficult to know what to do. So all I can say is I love this, and I would love to have further opportunities. And I'm still hoping. I was lined up to speak in Edmonton in September, something organized by the City Hall. My guess is that may not happen, but there will be other things. And you're not rid of me yet in Alberta. I guess that's the message.
Well, I feel fairly confident speaking on behalf of the Calgary Climate Hub and saying we'll take you anytime we can get you. Thanks so much for coming out here, Mark Jaccard. And I would say again to everybody who's hearing this broadcast, if you haven't read the book, read the book. It'll make you smarter. Just read it. Okay. Thanks again, Mark. Pleasure to meet you.
Thank you. It was a great time. Thank you. Bye.
All right. So that's it for this week's Climate of Change. Next week's guest is Calgary City Councillor Druh Farrell. I'm very excited about that. She's an excellent champion for climate in this city, and absolutely my favorite city councilor. If you want to participate in the Zoom broadcast, be sure to sign up for a Hub membership between now and then. Let's see. I want to make sure before I sign out here, if you liked this A Climate of Change Thursday night broadcast, we do it every Thursday live at 7:05. We want you to know once again that it wouldn't be possible without our excellent sponsor, Skyfire Energy. I'll say again, they've paved the way for solar in Western Canada and will certainly be a big part of our future. I'll also thank once again the Calgary Climate Hub, the organization that I give my time to and I work with to legitimately move the ball on climate in this city. And what I can tell you is if climate is something that you hold dear in your heart and it can affect your concern for climate can affect your mood and how you feel and your well-being, you need to become a part of a climate group. And of course, I'm going to recommend the Calgary Climate Hub. So you can go to calgaryclimatehub.ca to become a member. You can also donate to us because it's a tough row to hoe working climate in this city, as you might imagine. So we welcome your donations as well. They go right towards working on this incredibly important issue. Finally, I'll thank our volunteers who helped put this out. Shay Rogers is my production manager. Paul Russell is helping me with some audio video stuff, and Joan Lawrence is doing some great work. I'll say a co-producer in the background. Thank you so much for coming. Have a good night, and let's get to work.